Welcome to our encore presentation of RedShort, a view from Team Jaeger. Team Jaeger is our underground cyber collection and analysis team. Today we have our friends from Strafe Risk Management. Joe Fleming is the CEO, and Joe, if you can kind of give us a little intro on yourself and your company.
Thanks for having us today, first of all. It's great to join you guys. I think we got some interesting topics. On Strafe, we're a risk management firm. We serve corporate and government clients. On the corporate side, we focus on a number of risk issues, from some connections to cybersecurity and physical risk at critical infrastructure, all the way down to corporate investigations and compliance. On the government side, it's the same, focus on critical infrastructure as well as law enforcement training and government compliance with different international anti-money laundering and organized crime regimes. We have a good team of former U.S. law enforcement, former government officials, corporate experts. My background is from the corporate world. I've worked in government affairs as well as healthcare and oil and gas, mainly on the M&A side, looking at risk of acquisitions and understanding what liabilities companies I've worked for taking on the IT and other areas, sometimes in relation to cybersecurity. Jim is one of our law enforcement experts. I'll let him jump in and tell you about himself.
Good morning. Great to be with our friends up in New Hampshire. Good morning, Bill. Good morning, Jonathan. I'm one of the managing directors and senior strategists with Strafe, working with Joe, my partner, along with others. We're excited to be here today, and I think the thing that brought us together, we've had communication, but a few weeks back on February 5th of this month, a cyber attack at a Florida treatment plant, wherein a hacker who gained access to an Oldsmar, Florida city computer attempted to change the level of sodium hydroxide, which is commonly known as lye. He tried to change that in the water system there. Though admittedly it's been described by local officials as well as cyber experts as a rather crude attack, and the people of Oldsmar were never really, fortunately, put at risk. This incident underscored the need for strong security measures at the municipal level, not only at water, but all utilities. So it's not known right now whether the breach was from within the U.S. or outside the country, but the FBI and other local authorities are working on identifying the perpetrator and bringing appropriate charges if possible. But from a larger perspective, there's been a marked increase in the last couple of years in cyber incidents against state and local government entities. And a number of people, both on the cyber side as well as policymakers and lawmakers, have been saying, we've got to bring this issue front and center. And we've been calling for specifically an issue like this as a wake-up call. We know that there's been a significant uptick in cyber attacks across the board, and it's bringing increased attention to not only security industrial people, but also people at the municipal level who work in control systems.
Great. Before we dive into the subject matter here, I just want to introduce John Sweeney on our side. John is our program manager and cyber analyst, and John started with Red Sky Alliance several years ago and is currently the lead analyst for our Team Jaeger collection and analysis team. I'm Bill Schenkelberg. I'm the managing director here at Red Sky Alliance. And with that, I'm going to pass it back to you, Jim. You already talked about the topic, and we can dive into our discussion. Thanks, Jim.
Yeah, going back to what happened in Oldsmar, we know that there's in excess of 50,000 municipal water systems out there in the United States. And power generation and distribution is becoming more complex and more connected than ever before. 20 years ago, municipal water systems and electrical and other utility systems were not even connected to the internet. They were standalone systems. And today, that vulnerability related to critical infrastructure and technical facilities is a real concern, not only for folks in our business, but people at the local level politically. And we know the main target of hacktivists are not only water, but energy, public transportation systems, telecommunications, and critical manufacturing. So, you know, it's funny because it's funny. It's not funny, but it was front and center for us last week. You know, the impact on a municipal utility became reality for us down here in Houston a week ago. Though not due to a cyber attack, we experienced single-digit temperatures, which is not very common in Houston, Texas, and it knocked out portions of our electrical grid. It knocked out water and a significant portion of our communication. Most of us had no telephone and internet for 3 or 4 days. And the ensuing panic, the confusion, unfortunately, the loss of lives, and the overall impact on 6 million citizens that live in the metropolitan Houston area is still being felt here today, a week later. So on the cyber side, if during a particularly harsh winter, for example, we can only imagine the panic that would be spread by a group of hacktivists that brought down the US power grid. Imagine millions of homes, businesses plunged into darkness, communications cut, banks offline, hospitals closed, and air traffic control grounded. We know that the energy sector is one of the main targets of cyber attacks against critical infrastructure, but it's not the only one. Transportation, public sector, services, telecommunications, and critical manufacturing industries are also vulnerable. If we just look back a few years ago in 2013, for example, Iranian hacktivists were able to breach the Bowman Avenue Dam in New York and gain control of the floodgates. In December of 15, the world witnessed the first known actual power outage caused by a malicious cyber attack. 3 utility companies in Ukraine were hit by black energy malware, what was called black energy malware. You can probably talk about that a little bit, Jonathan. But it left hundreds of thousands of homes without electricity for 6 hours. So when we look across the board, oil rigs, ships, satellites, airliners, airports are all considered vulnerable. And we're seeing this across the board in all sectors. So with cyber attacks, I'll segue against critical infrastructure and key manufacturing industries steadily increasing, not only here, but around the globe, according to cybersecurity experts. I thought I'd turn to Jonathan and ask you, Jonathan, to just give a little history on cyber attacks against critical infrastructure.
Yeah, thanks, Jim. So at Red Sky Alliance, we study all different types of cyber attacks, and one of my favorite to study is attacks on cyber or on critical infrastructure. The reason that is because when you talk to people about things like stolen passwords, or even when you're stealing people's money out of their bank accounts, a lot of times it's, well, who cares if somebody has my password? I've got quote unquote nothing to hide. Or who cares if somebody breaks into my bank account? I've got insurance to back that up. One of the things that we're seeing in these attacks sort of escalating is the cyber physical aspect of it. And that results, that consequence has escalated pretty significantly from, financial damage or information damage, you lose your identity, that kind of thing, to now you risk death, which we actually saw last year in Germany. There was a hospital that was hit with ransomware. Not necessarily, it is part of the critical infrastructure, but a ransomware attack on a hospital, it seems that it's made the news now that somebody has died as a result of it. But until that point, it was kind of like, oh, another ransomware attack. Yeah, we'll just pay the ransom and move on. And we've seen this escalation of tactics and the Kiev power outage I'll talk about in a minute there, but we've seen this escalation of tactics, not only because the attackers themselves are becoming smarter, they're learning as they go along, and America is not necessarily learning as quickly as they are. One of the things that they're also increasing is their resources during these attacks. So, before in 2015, they had a set amount of resources, but now that they've ransomed a bunch of different networks, they've made millions of dollars. Yes, I'm sure they're spending it on some Lamborghinis and some nice toys, but they're also investing that in their capabilities and their own infrastructure. So we have seen attacks against critical infrastructure escalating, and I think it's, again, not because just that knowledge increase, but also the increase in resources that these attackers have. In regards to the Kiev blackout, I think one of the most interesting things about that to me, because, like I talk to Bill about all the time, is the human factor to that. So we live in the year 2021 where people who have been working at these companies for 20 years understand the new digital systems, but they also understand a lot of the old, lever and analog systems that don't necessarily run on the internet or OT or whatever, new advanced technologies. They know the old systems. In Kiev, one of the things that actually saved that from being a much worse situation was that employees who had worked there for a long time were actually knowledgeable enough to go out and physically go to the substations and switch the power back on. So, there was sort of a fallback procedure because they had those experienced employees who were familiar with those older systems. Now, in 20 years, we're going to have a lot of employees who are completely unfamiliar with any sort of analog system, any sort of old, quote unquote, outdated system. And they're not going to necessarily have employees to send out to the substations because employees will still be able to say, or they'll still say things like, well, I can't access it remotely, so therefore I can't access it at all. So as attackers are increasing their capabilities, increasing their attacks, and the sort of consequences of those attacks, we are not following with our defense at the same scale.
Yeah. Jonathan, good point. We were talking about water a little bit earlier, but I understand that with respect to history, there was an attack on an Israeli water supply. Could you highlight that a little bit?
Yeah, so last year, and actually it's good you talk about the sort of timing of these attacks. Last year in July of 2020, which, as you're probably aware, is a hot time in the Middle East, a very hot time, temperature-wise, there was an attack on two different water systems. Luckily, the attacks were detected. They were, the risk was mitigated. Everything turned out okay in that case. Israel blamed Iranian state actors for that. But we're still sort of investigating on our side to verify that. But attackers were basically able to log in into the systems, and instead of changing the lye levels, they actually changed the chlorine systems. I believe these were targeted towards like smaller areas, so like agricultural installations and things like that. So not as much damage per se, not as much consequence. But one of the problems you have with the agricultural side of things is now you've destroyed food for an entire village or an entire, group of people. And if you've already got issues with poverty or any sort of, food resources, that's pretty damaging.
Now, just curious, was there any terrorism nexus to that attack or that incident? Has that ever come out?
I can't honestly say one way or the other. I don't know enough about the situation. I mean, in my opinion, the idea of changing somebody's water supply to a lethal, changing the chemicals in their water supply to a lethal level is an act of terrorism. The only sort of pushback to that would be that the attackers didn't necessarily come out and say, we want this or else we're going to poison your system. In other words, they weren't trying to sort of pressure anybody politically because of it. It was more of just an attack. And it was, some could view it as a test, some could view it as a warning. And then could view it as the sort of end result, right? Because either way, people's water systems were affected, and that is a pretty significant. Right?
Okay, let's jump back from Israel back to Oldsmar, Florida. Joe, what do we know about what happened in Florida? What do we know?
So far in Florida, it appears that, again, you've touched on it, Jim. There were some adjustments that were made that didn't really take effect. There were that couldn't have taken effect due to other safeguards in the system. But, I think what we know at this point is really the vector of attack here is that the facility had a commercial remote access tool, TeamViewer, just not too much different than what we're on right now, video sharing, screen sharing tool. And, all of the employees of the facility were sharing the same insecure password. And at first appearance, and based on kind of the attack, the initial thought is that it's probably kind of a local attacker or a domestic attacker that's really just looking to cause trouble more than anything else. And again, luckily they didn't, but the attack surface is so broad at these facilities. The security is incredibly lax. And I think it's certainly a wake-up call. These facilities, Florida was by no means an outlier. we've had some exposure to these facilities at Strafe, discussions on security with different vendors and different suppliers, and it's fairly common. I mean, there are facilities out there, at the large city municipal level that have full IT security teams, but the vast majority of these facilities are managed by some outsourced company that just goes and basically replenishes chemicals. They adjust the levels when they need to be adjusted. For ease of use and cost, they're installing commercial off-the-shelf tools. They're installing insecure Wi-Fi. They're in some cases using phone trees to manage the system. I think, again, while this attack, it doesn't really have the fingerprints of the Russians or the Iranians or the North Koreans, it speaks to if some guy at what we think right now, and I'll stereotype a bit, some guy sitting in his parents' basement is doing this. Imagine what a real adversary could do.
Sure.
Someone, the getting into the system was easy. He was able to access the industrial control system for the facility. The fact that the attacker didn't know how to effectively disrupt that system doesn't mean this is a major flaw. I'd point to, based on our conversation with Israel, they were on the flip side of this attack, the attack on the Natanz nuclear reactor facility in Iran. And the parallel here is that once you have access to industrial systems, what they did in that attack was they were able to adjust the parameters of the nuclear centrifuges that are making nuclear fuel so that they actually spun faster than they were designed to and destroyed themselves. Now, a chemical imbalance is one thing, but, imagine a hacker, you have full access to the industrial control system. If you can put things out of parameter where the system effectively destroys itself, you now have no potable water for that area, right? And this was a major issue again during the flood in Houston because pipes broke, whatnot. The lack of drinking water was a major problem for days and days afterwards. The lack of sewage treatment, these are things that are dangerous issues. And these are kind of the things that are just really on the horizon, with these facilities that are completely unsecured, which, like Jim said, are many tens of thousands. Again, it's one thing you change some chemical levels, it could be bad. But, at the end of the day, someone like you mentioned, Jonathan, in Ukraine, all you need is that guy to go turn the physical knob and turn it back on. I think what we should be worried about is, the risk that, the lack of security of these facilities opens the door to attacks that could destroy the equipment on facility where, okay, you're looking at, weeks to months before new equipment can be delivered on site. The equipment and water treatment facilities, they don't have backups. This is not off the shelf equipment. Many times it's fabricated specifically to certain engineering parameters for that site. You can't just go down to your Home Depot and buy a new motor for your water treatment system. This is something that could shut down water for a city for months.
Yeah.
And can I just jump in on that point about the Stuxnet at Natanz? So one of the interesting aspects about that was the attackers, when they infected the plant with malware, the malware wasn't activated, or the centrifuges didn't immediately start blowing up. They didn't start immediately getting damaged. That malware monitored what devices it infected to make sure that it had the right devices, and it made sure there were some parameters to ensure that it was in the right device. Now, why I bring that up is because with this Florida hack, we're finding that this person, he or she, logged into the remotely logged into an industrial control system and was able to change those levels. That person didn't know how to necessarily alter those levels. They didn't know how to, complete that sort of mission. I can tell you that if I'm thinking from the perspective of a nation state actor, what I'm going to do is I'm going to first get access to things like your water supply, your electrical, your dams, whatever critical infrastructure I would essentially destroy in a time of warfare or in time of conflict. And I'm going to sit there and I'm going to wait and I'm going to monitor and I'm just going to, remain quiet and just basically sit like a back door and just wait. Now, this individual or group actually, sort of pulled the trigger and tried to change those levels. But what my major concern is people who aren't pulling the trigger, people who are currently in the system, they're sitting there waiting for a time of conflict or for the, the quote unquote right moment. And then, they've already got the access, and those people or those groups do know how to cause that damage. They do know how to bypass those controls and change the chemical levels. Now, I would hope that we have plenty of, sort of fallback and controls that would prevent that, like we sort of had in this case, but, I just don't know that. And I don't really have that high confidence level to expect that.
Yeah.
And I think, with these facilities, it really all comes down to kind of threat modeling and assessing what your actual risk is. Minimum work needs to be done. At the end of the day, I think, a municipal water treatment facility that serves 50,000 homes, they don't have the budget, they don't have the expertise to protect against, a targeted nation state level attack, but they do have the budget. There is expertise out there, like us, like you guys, who can advise on, what is the real threat for you? What is the low hanging fruit? It's inexcusable to have open Wi-Fi. It's inexcusable to share passwords that are insecure for your remote management system. And these are things that, from a budgetary standpoint, change your password. It's not that hard. Create separate user accounts. It's not that hard. Yeah. It's just the checklist of what to do that these guys have problems with. And the reality is, a lot of these facilities, again, they have contract labor that manages the facility, just like you'd hire if you have a pool. You have a pool company come adjust your levels. Those people, as good as they are at running a facility, they're not cybersecurity experts,
right?
And the management of these facilities, in many cases, certainly in Texas, what we found is the management of a lot of these facilities are the attorney for the district that kind of put the whole municipal district together, because, well, now we don't have to hire someone who's dedicated.
Right.
It's just a lack of expertise and understanding. I think the more we can do to highlight the risks here, but not only the risks, but the extreme ease at which you can remediate 90% of the issues you have. If you can stop your local kids from getting in the water facility, if you can stop your domestic troublemakers, maybe if the Russians want to target you specifically, you're going to have a tough time. But at the same time, you can reduce your attack surface by many multiples just by taking simple precautions.
Those vulnerabilities. Good point, Joe. Good point.
So can I? Oh, sorry, go ahead.
Statistically, though, what we're seeing, the experts in Washington are telling us that attacks of this nature, and all across the board, attacks are increasing upwards of 20% a year. I mean, what are the implications of that, Jonathan, Joe? What are the implications of the significant increase or the uptick in cyber attacks across the board against all sectors?
Yeah, so I think, as cynical as it may sound, the implications are as much as the public is willing to sort of make them into. So until we have an example, like a cyber attack on the Florida water system, or an attack on an electrical supply in Colorado or something like that, until we have those, that's when we're like, oh yeah, maybe we should secure our water supply, or oh, maybe we should work with cybersecurity in our systems. And that kind of is a cynical point of view, but how long have we been dealing with phishing? Since like the 90s? I mean, these are not, the idea of, somebody remotely accessed an industrial control system, okay, that's, by itself, that's like a little, questionable. But the fact that they were able to access it, like Joe said, using commercial software, they're sharing passwords, there's no form of multi-factor authentication, which is, again, not invincible by itself. You know, there's sort of a lot of sort of obvious things that we've had available information-wise for these people and for these really all critical infrastructure. We've had those standards and those different compliance regulations and things like that available for years, and they haven't, you know, people haven't done the simple stuff, like Joe said, the low-hanging fruit. And you know, they are understaffed, they are under budgeted, but you don't need an extra budget to have a complex password. You don't necessarily need a better budget to be able to, you know, encrypt whatever, you know, network traffic you have going on. You may have to spend a little extra money, but what are the sort of, you know, budgetary and human costs in the event of a failure of those, you know, those standards? And again, my biggest problem with really all of these attacks is they're not, you know, some super 0-day attack that, you know, some APT in Russia or China or Iran came up with. This is a person found out a password and was able to change, you know, or attempt to change, I should say, chemical levels in a water supply. And that to me is just unacceptable and just really inexcusable.
And I think you know, a good way to think about it is, look, these facilities, small facility, you know, they're building the facility. They spent $20,000 on a 12-foot chain link fence with barbed wire around it to keep people out.
Right.
And they spent $0 on cybersecurity.
Yeah.
They bought their $300 at most, you know, Netgear router with Wi-Fi, open Wi-Fi. You know, the facilities, many of them, they're not designed for remote access. The facility management is just jerry-rigging it so they don't have to go out to these remote facilities and do maintenance. You know, I think there are things that certainly the facility management can and should do. There are things that the water treatment engineering companies, when they're designing these facilities, should do. You know, they should design them. You know, there should be a cybersecurity component when you're building a new facility. You know, I had a conversation with a water treatment company, an engineering company, just a few months ago before all of this, and, you know, discussing cybersecurity. And one of their discussions was, well, most of our clients don't spec in any cybersecurity. We don't build into our engineering plans, our electrical plans, any type of remote access or SCADA controls. Sometimes there's a phone line that controls it, but, you know, they kind of do that after the fact. They get they get an internet connection and they tie in some Wi-Fi, and it's up to them to do it. You know, they're programming these complex industrial systems. They're building these complex, you know, the engineering for these facilities. It's not that much more to, you know, tie in your cybersecurity there. That's where it makes sense when you're building these facilities. Certainly, there's facilities that are already built that's not going to change. There's things to do, but, you know, and it may be that that's an issue for policymakers, that there's a requirement. I mean, even major water facilities like the city of Houston, weren't required to do cybersecurity audits under federal law until just about, I think it was 2018 or 19.
Yeah.
Smaller facilities weren't required to do, you know, even the most basic audits until 2021.
Right. And who's in charge of all that, right? It's like, who's the person or the group who we go to and we say, how did you let a water hack happen? Is it the NSA? Is it CISA? Is it the DHS? I mean, is it the EPA who's supposed
and
to?
And in this case, it's the EPA, which, right, you know, given their purview, you know, over clean water, I think it makes sense. But, you know, the EPA is not a cybersecurity agency.
Exactly.
You know, this is not within their area of expertise. You know, I don't know that it makes sense for them to be regulating, but, you know, that's how our government works. Some things don't always make sense. You know, it's complicated to get legislation passed and understand who's managing what. But, you know, that comes back down to the facility managers that, you know, whether our government is highly effective or maybe it could be more effective, at the end of the day, you know, the vast majority of work is on them to do. And again, it's not simple. It's not complicated work. It's not expensive work. And it's certainly worthwhile. You know, like I said a few minutes ago, if you're going to spend that money to build your chain link fence because you're afraid of someone walking on the facility, why not build that cybersecurity fence? It's just as important, if not more important.
Yeah. Jonathan, any final comments on mitigating steps that could be taken? Anything else you want to add?
Yeah, I think as information security people, I mean, we are part of it, but I sort of look to the government to a certain extent to put out some sort of measures, and I hate to say the word standards or regulations, but some sort of standards set by somebody who's educated, not legislators, somebody who's educated on cyber and the sort of, networking and basics of computers. Those people should be making policies that somebody can look to, whether they're, small town Peterborough, New Hampshire, or Houston, Texas power plants. You need to be following all of the same standards at a very basic level. And I always, sometimes I talk about what the CDC has for zombies, and it sounds like a joke, but the CDC actually has a website designated to a zombie attack or a zombie apocalypse. They don't do this because they think there's actually going to be a zombie apocalypse. They do this because if you're prepared for a zombie apocalypse, if you have water, food, shelter, and all that stuff, you are also prepared for things like hurricanes and other, natural disasters or flooding or something else that may happen. So we need to put something out to the public that will, make them say, that will somehow motivate them to be compliant, that will show them, the reasoning behind it and the benefit behind it. Because as a security guy, I can't tell you how many conversations I come into where I'm sort of the bad guy who comes in and just.
I think we lost Jonathan there.
I think he's the victim of an attack, Bill.
Yeah, that's because he was talking about zombies there. but I think if I can follow up with him, I think there's so much of, and coming from my angle, there's a human element to all this stuff, and we need to train our people on the basics of cybersecurity, like changing passwords, making them complicated, so someone won't pick out your dog's name or something like that. So that was always what intrigued me with cybersecurity is it was that human element side to it, and a lot of that really doesn't cost a whole heck of a lot to manage and to implement. So Jonathan's back. We thought maybe that a zombie got you or something.
Yeah, sorry, the zombies heard me talking about them. Yeah, no, but the idea is we need to put something out that's appealing to people. That's not the same traditional. Oh, if you see a bad email, tell somebody about it. It's like we need to start educating people in a way that they're going to want to do this stuff. And it's we can blame the water supply or the electrical company all we want, but it's the people who are knowledgeable in this stuff's responsibility to go to those people and show them how it's done and to properly educate them. And I think that we as information security people, risk analysis or risk analysts really need to do a better job of communicating the sort of benefits and reasons behind cybersecurity.
Yeah. With that, Bill, I'd like, on behalf of Strife and my partner Joe, we'd like to say thanks for making us a part of this very important discussion today in the wake of what we've seen in recent weeks.
Well, yeah, and I'd like to thank you, Joe, Jim, and Jonathan for a great discussion here. You guys are the risk management people, and we're the cybersecurity. And I think in that combination, that hopefully we can help people with their to mitigate these risks and vulnerabilities out there, because they're real and they're happening and they're escalating, and we need to do something about it. I think one of the main things of our discussion here is that there's so many operating systems now that are not properly integrated with cyber and with the cyber safeguards and procedures. So hopefully we can help people in the future. So give us a call, give Strafe a call, and we hopefully mitigate and help people out in the future there. So
great.
So we hope you enjoyed our discussion here today, and we hope that you can join us with Red Sky Alliance in the future, because next month we're going to have a similar webinar like this on an interesting topic. With that, I'll say goodbye and thanks again to everyone.
Thank you.
Thanks all.